Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Cultivating Success Small Farms webinar. Today, our topic is the fundamental of produce safety, part 2, and our presenter is Stephanie Smith. Cultivating Success is a partnership of University of Idaho Extension, the nonprofit organization Rural Roots, and Washington State University Food Systems Program. Today's presenter is Stephanie Smith. She presented the first part of this series last week, and you can find that recording on the Cultivating Success website. I am Colette D. Phelps. I'm with University of Idaho Extension, located in Moscow, Idaho, and I will be your moderator today. Just a couple of quick webinar tips before we jump into the topic. So, we are all sharing a ton of bandwidth right now as we work from home, and sometimes you may experience your sound or the slides going forward a little slower than normal. If that is the case, you can always type into the chat, and I will let you know if that is happening on your side or if that is something that is going on Stephanie's side. If at any time you're having difficulties on your side, it could be helpful to close the other programs running on your computer and perhaps even switch to the phone for your audio. A phone number to call in on is in the welcome email. And if you do switch to your audio on the phone, go ahead and mute your computer sound to avoid getting feedback. I emailed everyone who had registered by about 10:40 this morning for this webinar a full-page version of the handouts in PDF, so you don't have to write down the information Stephanie is providing. And then if you do want a printable version of the handout, it will be available on the Cultivating Success website. The printable version was a little bit larger as a file, and so I didn't want it to clog up your computer, so you can download that if you would like. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the webinar over to Stephanie. Thank you for joining us, Stephanie.
Thank you for having us, or having me. Let me go ahead and share the screen. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the slides.
We can.
You can, great. I want to thank you all for joining me again today. If you did not catch the Fundamentals of Produce Safety Part 1, it is recorded and available on the Cultivating Success website. Today, we will go over just a couple of things as a reminder from the Part 1 from last week, and then we'll dive into more specific topics within the produce safety rule and talk about some best practices and things that you can start doing today to make sure that you're delivering safe produce to consumers and working towards complying with the produce safety rule, even if you're exempt. The topics that we're going to cover today are agricultural water quality and usage, post-harvest handling, and developing a food safety plan for your farm. I do want to add this disclaimer again that this is not an official produce safety rule training. If you are interested in taking the Produce Safety Alliance Growers training, which is the FDA recognized and official training, there's a link that you can click on to take you to receive more information on the training and where the training is being offered. We will be providing an overview today on some of the topic requirements and then again some tips for getting started. So with that, I just wanted to provide a brief review of Part 1 in case not everybody on this call was on the Part 1 call. So as a reminder, there have been a lot of foodborne illness outbreaks from fresh produce. So from 1996 to 2010, 23% of all outbreaks were caused by produce. And from 2006 to 2014, 16 of 68 multi-state foodborne illness outbreaks were associated with vegetables. We're mostly concerned with bacteria, although viruses are a concern as well, and parasites, but bacteria cause the most outbreaks, illnesses, and deaths. And so there's really a big focus on preventing contamination of produce with microorganisms and especially bacteria. The Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law in 2011. It encompasses all aspects of the food system to prevent food safety hazards across the entire food system. So the one we're focusing on today, of course, is the produce safety rule. And one thing is, even we talked about in part one about different exemptions that are that one might have depending on what they're growing, how that produce is being processed, and other things. So even if you're exempt from the rule, it's still important to follow, to try to work towards compliance with the rule, because a lot of buyers are going to want to see that you're following produce safety practices and that you're producing safe food. So it's a good idea to work towards compliance regardless if you're covered or not. For businesses that are covered, everybody needed to be in compliance with the rule beginning by January 27th of this year. So very small businesses had to start complying as of January of 2020. There are separate water-related compliance dates, and we'll talk more about that in the slides today. So all businesses with sales greater than 500,000 per year adjusted for inflation need to start complying with the rule in 2 years, followed by small businesses in 2023 and very small businesses in 2024. And again, we'll talk more about this in a moment. Even if you are exempt from the produce safety rule, there are some requirements still. So you have to prominently and conspicuously display the name of the business, the complete business address, and either put this on a label on the product or have it available at the point of purchase. There are additional requirements which include performing annual reviews and verification that you're exempt from the rule and that you're eligible for that exemption, and then keeping documentation showing that you're exempt. And again, if you want more details on this, please do review the first part of this series. Additional topics that we covered in part one was a little more of an introduction to the FSMA produce safety rule, and we talked about soil amendments, worker health and hygiene, and wildlife and domestic animals. So for this webinar, we're going to get started about talking about agricultural water quality and usage. There's two different types of agricultural water. The first type is called production water, and this water is used during plant growth. And this includes, of course, irrigation, but also other things like foliar sprays and frost protection. So again, anything used during plant growth. The second type of water, of agricultural water, is post-harvest water. And this is water that's used during or after harvest. And this can include things like ice, fungicides, waxes, any rinsing or wash water, hand washing, cleaning and sanitizing, and more. And so there's the importance of these two different water types we'll talk about in a moment, but basically they have different criteria under the produce safety rule. So again, with the water-related compliance dates, initially these were supposed to, the water compliance dates were the same as the regular compliance dates for the FSMA produce safety rule, but there were some concerns with regard to trying to comply with the water testing requirements, which we'll talk about in a moment. So right now, these are the compliance dates where you're supposed to begin testing of your water. And we'll talk more about testing in a moment and what the requirements are. But so if you're if you fall under the very small business category, you would begin water testing in 2024. So we're going to talk more specifically about production water now. So this is, again, the water used during plant growth. Under the produce safety rule, the water quality requirements are 126 or less colony-forming units of generic E. coli per 100 milliliters of water geometric mean. So the geometric mean is the average amount of generic E. coli in the sample. On top of that, the other requirement is that you have 410 or less colony-forming units of generic E. coli per 100 milliliters, a statistical threshold value. So this can be really confusing, and it can take a while to try to explain this, but the statistical threshold value is the variation that you would see over time in E. coli levels. There are calculators available to help you with this. So basically what you would do is you would test your water, which we'll talk about in a moment, and then you can enter the data from your test results into the calculator, and it'll tell you what the geometric mean is and what the statistical threshold value is. And then from that data, you would look at it and make sure that you meet these two requirements. So, that's the requirement for this type of water usage. There's also testing frequency requirements under the rule. So if you're using a public water supply, it is sufficient to just get a copy of the test results or a current certificate of compliance from the utility. If you're using groundwater, so that would be like well water, you have to test 4 or more times during the growing season over the period of a year. Each year thereafter, you have to take 1 or more samples and have those tested, and then you would roll that number into your testing requirements profile. So for example, you would do 4 tests in the first year. In year 2, you would do 1 test. You would then take the results from that 1 test and add it to the 4. The first test you did in year 1, you would get rid of that, but you would add the test you just did from year 2 into your profile and then redo your calculations. So it can get kind of complex. There's more resources available to help you with that. So the goal is just to kind of give you an overview of the testing requirements. And if you need more help, I'll give you resources at the end that discuss how to go about doing testing, you know, where you can, resources you can click on to get more information about testing, about calculators, and about requirements. So this is just kind of a broad overview of the rule. Surface water is more of a concern because it's more likely to be contaminated. So if you're using surface water, so things like an irrigation ditch, a pond, anything exposed to the environment, the rule requires you to do 20 or more tests over a period of 2 to 4 years. Thereafter, you would do 5 tests per year, and those 5 tests would be rolled into your initial test, and then your oldest test that you did would then get kicked out of the calculations. So you're always having like a rolling 20 tests that are being used to calculate your geometric mean or your STV. The rule also specifically states different testing methodologies, and this is one of the reasons why there's been a delay in having to comply with a regulation. Initially, FDA said you have to use EPA method 1603. That was a really big problem because there weren't a lot of labs in states that were using this method. On top of it, the method required that the sample be taken, delivered, and tested within the lab within a very short time frame, which made it extremely difficult for growers to comply with. So there have been additional test methods that have been added. We're not going to talk about the methods in detail, but just to give you a list of different methods. So if you do decide to start testing your water, please refer back to these slides. If you find a lab that you want to do your water testing, you can look and make sure that they're doing one of these tests that are approved by the FDA. So this is the first set of tests. And then the second slide gives some additional tests that can be used. So if you're going to do testing, it's a good idea to make sure the lab is using one of these methods. So why the focus on agricultural water? Well, we know that water is a potential vector for contamination. And when we, talk about like the romaine lettuce recalls we've had over the last several years, there's a really good chance that a lot of that was from contaminated water, in addition to potential wood drift and other issues. But water is a major vector for carrying contamination. There can be animal feces in the water, especially if you're using surface water, and you might have, geese or, other birds that are landing in the water. I have a picture here of a cow standing by a water source that could potentially be used, downstream for growing produce. And we know that cattle can carry E. coli and pathogenic E. coli at that. So that's a major way that produce can become contaminated. There can be issues with agricultural runoff, again, from like things like manure piles or even just general runoff from, soil that might be contaminated. And then there's issues of potential flooding that can occur, whether it's flooding due to weather or whether there's intentional flooding that occurs as part of irrigation. Those are all potential risks for how produce can come in contact with water that's contaminated. So there's a lot of different ways that this can occur, and it's a really big concern. There's also different risks depending on how irrigation happens. So overhead irrigation is the riskiest because if the water is contaminated, you're now spraying down the entire plant, and the water's coming in contact with the entire plant. So there's a higher likelihood that if the water's contaminated, that the harvestable portion of the crop is also going to become contaminated. With flooding, whether it's purposeful for irrigation or whether it's a weather event, again, you're looking at potential movement of contaminants into the growing area. And then also that water coming into direct contact with the edible portion of the produce. Drip irrigation is generally the safest because generally speaking, the produce is not in direct contact with the water. So we always encourage people, if it's possible to use drip irrigation, do, because it's going to lower your risk. Or depending on what you're growing too. For instance, if you're growing, in Washington, a lot of people grow tree fruit. So if you have sprayers that are lower to the ground and not coming in contact with the apples, that's less risky as well. So I have a list of different steps that can be taken to reduce some of these risks. So specifically looking at your sources, you really want to assess your sources and take a good look at them and identify ways that your water sources can become contaminated. If you're using groundwater, you need to inspect your wellheads and make sure that you aren't having any risk of contamination and contaminated water going into your wellhead. It's good to have the land slope away from your wellhead as well, so that you're not getting runoff into your wellhead. And then you want to have backflow prevention systems on your wellhead to make sure that you don't get contamination of your groundwater. And then always check your connections and piping to make sure that they're in good condition and that you're not going to get seepage of contaminants into your piping. Again, with surface water, this poses a lot more risk. So there's a potential for animal access. Of course, you have runoff risk. And then upstream activities can greatly influence the quality of your water. Even if it's, 50 miles upstream, if there is a feedlot, for instance, that's running right past your water source, then that is a potential risk for your surface water source. So you want to be aware of that and know what's going on upstream with your water supply. And again, the connections and piping are important as well. With municipal sources, you're mostly concerned with the connections and piping, and then also potential distribution issues. So a lot of times with municipal sources, there can be issues where there's been a backflow problem and they end up having to flush the entire system. If that happens, then it's not a good idea to use that water when you're approaching harvest of the produce, because you're going to increase the risk for contamination. So you really want to be aware of these things and then take steps to prevent prevent irrigating with contaminated water. So again, you really want to pay attention to upstream water activities. And then there's other things that can happen upstream as well that can contaminate water, such as if the neighbor's septic system leaks, that can be a major problem. You want to be able to address runoff issues on your farm as well. So if you're using manure or compost, for example, you don't want that running off into your water source. So some of the things you can do is build diversion ditches. You can put in berms. You want to cover compost and manure piles. So anything that you can do to address potential runoff issues is going to be important. Wind drift is also a major problem, especially with placement of manure and compost piles. So you don't want to have, if you generally have winds out of the west, you don't want to have your manure and compost piles west of your growing area, right? Because then it could blow that, or west of your water source, because then it can blow those products into your water and cause contamination. So you always want to make sure that they're covered. You want to control animal access. We know that animals carry pathogens, so you want to keep animals out of your water sources, especially groundwater or your surface water sources. And then work with neighbors to see what they can do to help ensure that you're using safe water for your crops. If you do find out that the water is contaminated, you need to make sure you do not harvest contaminated produce. So it specifically states in the produce safety rule that you cannot harvest contaminated produce. Even if you're exempt from the rule, you do not want to harvest contaminated produce. It's too risky, and you don't want to potentially have to do a recall or cause a foodborne illness outbreak. There is, you can't apply a time interval for microbial die-off. So when we get into the calculations for bacteria, it says that you can apply a half log per day up to 4 consecutive days. So to meet the water quality criteria. And if you're interested in this, let us know. We can provide more information. This topic is pretty intense. So again, trying to provide an overview on the topic can be a little difficult without, within the time constraints, without diving too deep into these specifics. But we're more than happy to help you with that if that's something you're interested in getting more information about. If you do have a problem, you want to, of course, correct the problem, and then it's a good idea to retest your water to ensure that that it was effective, that whatever you did to correct the problem was effective. It is also possible to treat the water, so you can use EPA registered chemicals. You can do, if you're using well water, you can shock the water. You can use UV light, although UV light has some pitfalls, because if the water has a lot of other matter in it, then the UV light can't really penetrate well to kill off microorganisms. And then, of course, you can use filtration, but that can tend to be expensive. Regardless, if you do have a water issue, then you want to be able to have a backup water source to be able to use until the problem can be addressed, so that you can keep your crops safe. Under the produce safety rule, there are required records. So these records include water testing results, inspections of your systems, of your irrigation systems, to make sure that they're working properly and that they're not contaminated. If you're doing treatments, then you need to perform monitoring to make sure that the treatments are applied correctly and that they were effective. So you need to keep records for those. If there is a problem with the water and you apply corrective action, you need to keep records of those. And then also, if you use other methods for testing, so we talked about different testing methods that were approved by FDA. You can use other methods, but you need to make sure that that you have scientific data and information to back use of those methods, both for testing and then also for any corrective actions you're applying. So it's good to have that information. You want to have that information available. That's required. Those are required records. However, as a smaller grower that might be exempt from the rule, of course, you don't necessarily have to meet these stringencies, but it's a good idea to test your water so that you can understand its quality. Are you having, issues with bacterial contamination, and are you having high, amounts of E. coli in your water? If you do your testing, then you know what your water quality is, and you can take steps then to switch to safer methods or to address any water quality issues you're having, so that you can ensure your produce is safe. You also want to do regular assessment of the risk and make sure that you're keeping your water system safe. So things that you can do now are like move manure and compost piles, address any potential runoff or wind drift issues. And then if you're using surface water, identify upstream activities that might be occurring that might affect the quality of your water, and then see if you can take steps to try to address those. So maybe you need to switch over to a different water source, or put other systems in place to make sure that the water quality is maintained. And then, of course, you want to be keeping records of these things. So you can begin now starting to keep records, especially if you're doing water testing. We're going to move on now to talk about post-harvest water. So this again is water used during harvest or after harvest, and includes things like ice and hand washing water. The requirements are different for this water. There can be no detectable generic E. coli per 100 milliliters of sample taken, a water sample. Additionally, you cannot use surface water for your post-harvest water. So I already talked about some of the examples of what's covered under your post-harvest water, but basically it is anything that's in direct contact with produce during or after harvest, and anything in direct contact with food contact surfaces. So if you're doing cleaning and sanitizing of a surface, then that is going to fall under these post-harvest water requirements. And then of course, ice and hand washing water. The rule specifically states that the water quality has to be managed, and you need to have water change schedules. So you need to know, for instance, if you're using a dump tank to move produce, for example, how often does that water need to be changed? If you're using spraying the water that's being recycled, how often does that water need to be changed? And if you're using antimicrobials in that water, then you have to be actively managing those antimicrobials. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. Moreover, the rule specifically states that the water that's being used has to be properly disposed of to reduce the risk of recontamination, and then also to meet other regulations from state and local governments or the EPA. The water testing frequency is similar. So for public water, or the frequency requirements are similar. So for public water supply, you need to have a copy of the test results or current certificate of compliance from the public water supplier, so from the utility. And then if you're using groundwater, again, the testing requirement is 4 or more times during the growing season over the period of the first year, and then 1 or more tests thereafter for each year thereafter. A little bit more about the use of antimicrobials. Again, the rule specifically states that the water must be of safe and adequate sanitary quality. You do not have to use antimicrobials, but they are very helpful to use. However, if you are going to use an antimicrobial, you must maintain it properly. So it's also important to know that antimicrobials in the water are only to help maintain the water quality and reduce the pathogens, the disease-causing organisms in the actual water, that they're not used for removing pathogens for the produce. So that's something that's often misunderstood. So just be aware of that it's for keeping the pathogen load in the actual water at a low level. Also, with the use of antimicrobials, the label is the law, so it needs to be followed. And for depending on the antimicrobial you're using, it's going to have different effectiveness at different pH ranges, different temperatures. So you need to really pay attention to the label. If the label says that you need to use it at a pH between 6 and 9, then you're going to need to test to make sure that your water pH is between 6 and 9 for that antimicrobial to be effective. There's many different types of antimicrobials. Some of the more common ones that are used are chlorine, so bleach, and then peroxyacetic acid. And there's a lot of different organic formulations that can be used as well. For monitoring and corrective actions, some of the things that you should be monitoring if you're using an antimicrobial is to make sure that they are at the proper concentration. So there's different ways that you can test that depending on what product you're using, and your supplier should be able to help you with identifying which test you should be performing to make sure that the concentration of antimicrobial in the water is at the proper concentration. Regardless, you need to maintain your water quality, so you need to determine when is the water going to need to be changed. You can do a visual, inspection for turbidity and say, okay, the water is looking very turbid, very dirty. It needs to be changed, but there should be criteria for how often are you going to monitor that turbidity, and at what point does it become too turbid where that water needs to be changed. And then you want to do monitoring for how often the water is being changed, because this can help identify problems or trends. So one thing that we see in larger packing operations especially is that under certain time frames they might not be processing as much, so they're not going to have to adjust the antimicrobials as much or change the water as often. But then they might start getting large loads of produce in. They might be using dump tanks where the bins are dirtier than they should be. That's going to affect the water quality, and they might have to change the water a lot more often. So by doing monitoring, you can know that, okay, during these time periods, we need to have additional antimicrobials on hand, or we might need to be changing the water at a more frequent level. So monitoring can help with that. For corrective actions, you want to make sure you perform these. For instance, when the antimicrobials are below their effective level. So the corrective action would be, maybe you're going to have to add more antimicrobials if it's not within range. Or if you're doing monitoring and the records aren't complete, then that might be a corrective action where you need to go in and tell somebody, okay, you're not completing these records properly, and you need to take steps to make sure that your monitoring records are being completed accurately and on time. And the rule does say that you need to keep records for both your monitoring and your corrective actions that you take. So some of the steps that you can take now as a small or very small grower is to start performing your testing again to make sure that you're using water that is of adequate quality, that the water is safe. And then again, if it's not, putting corrective actions into place so that you can make sure that the water you are using is going to be of adequate quality. With sanitizers, if you do use a sanitizer and you're going to use a sanitizer, you want to make sure that you're using it per label instructions. And then you want to be monitoring it regularly to make sure that the water that you're using is at the proper pH range, for instance, or the proper temperature for use with that particular sanitizer. And again, making sure you follow the instructions on the label. And it's also a good idea to develop standard operating procedures or SOPs that put into place as to how often the sanitizer needs to be checked, how often maybe you need to change the water or change out the sanitizers, how often it needs to be monitored. So it's a good idea to have those written procedures in place. And then of course, keep records for both your monitoring, what's being monitored, how often, and then your water quality test records should be kept, and then also any corrective actions that you put into place to address problems that might arise. We're now going to move on to talking about post-harvest handling. So There's going to be a lot more regulations in here, and then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things to focus on, and of course with steps that you can take now. So under the produce safety rule, it's really important to know that dropped produce cannot be harvested. So if you're growing something and it falls to the ground, it's the produce covered under the rule. It's not going to go on for further processing that's going to kill pathogens. Then you cannot harvest that produce if it's fallen to the ground, because it's now potentially contaminated and risky. The rule also specifically states that covered produce needs to be kept separated from excluded produce. So there's, in part 1, we talked about produce that was excluded from the rule, whereas versus other produce that's covered under the regulation. So if you're processing both types of produce, then you need to make sure that produce that is covered under these regulations is kept separate from produce that's excluded from these regulations. The rule also specifically states that you need to clean and sanitize the surfaces between covered and non-covered produce contact. So that's really important to know. So if you're using a table, for instance, for sorting produce that is covered under the regulations versus produce that's not covered under the regulations, you need to perform cleaning and sanitizing in between those. We covered worker health and hygiene and training in part 1, but the rule specifically states with regard to post-harvest handling that you need to identify produce that cannot be harvested, so produce that might be contaminated. Workers or people need to inspect to ensure harvest containers are clean and maintained properly, and anybody that is doing harvesting needs to know how to correct problems with harvest containers or equipment, or report any problems to the appropriate person and who that person is. Additional regulations under the rule are that buildings must be a suitable size, construction, and design to facilitate maintenance and sanitary operations. So they do recognize that post-harvest operations can occur in many types of different buildings. Some buildings might be more open, others might be more closed. But at the end of the day, they have to be of suitable size, construction, design, so that you can have sanitary operations. Contact surfaces, which also includes equipment and tools, so anything coming in contact with the produce or other surfaces that are non-food contact surfaces need to be inspected, maintained, and cleaned regularly, and sanitized as appropriate. And more specifically with equipment and tools, these have to be of adequate design, construction, and workmanship to enable cleaning. Any equipment needs to be installed properly to enable cleaning and maintenance. And you also have to be doing inspections to make sure that they're working, that they're clean, being cleaned and sanitized properly, and that they're in good working order. If equipment has seams, the seams have to be smoothly bonded or maintained to minimize accumulation of dirt, filth, and food products. This is because bacteria can grow easily within those seams. And so if it's difficult to get in there to clean and maintain it, then you're going to have a potential risk of bacteria growing, which can then contaminate produce. A little more about reducing risk in packing facilities. You want to make sure that you're keeping your facilities clean. You need to have toileting and hand washing facilities available to anybody that is inside that packing area. You want to make sure that you're managing and eliminating pests. So you should have a pest control program in place. There's a lot of different companies that can assist you with pest control programs and provide advice on those. So that's something that you can be doing now. Standing water is one of your worst enemies because anywhere there's standing water, you can have bacterial growth. So you want to make sure that you're keeping standing water to a minimum. And then, of course, trash, debris, and coal piles, they're not only a great harborage site for bacteria, but they're also a great harborage site for pests. So you want to make sure that in your packing facilities that these things are being removed often, and that the area, again, it comes back to just keeping the facilities clean. Any tools that are being used should be clean and sanitized properly, and you want them to be organized and to also be stored properly, especially after doing cleaning and sanitizing. And then if you are retrofitting equipment, you want to make sure that it's going to meet requirements where you can clean and sanitize that equipment. And make sure that there aren't any things like spot welds that will allow debris and water in there, which can then allow bacteria to grow. So if you're going to reuse equipment, you want to make sure that it's proper, that it's in proper condition for the job that it's doing, and that you can clean and sanitize it. I'm going to talk briefly about zones in the packing house and why these are important. So zone 1, I did take this from the Produce Safety Alliance training. So zone 1 is anything that's in direct contact with food. So these surfaces, you want to make sure that you're prioritizing your cleaning and sanitation efforts. So zone 1 is the riskiest because it's in direct contact with food. So you need to make sure that you're putting in very high efforts on cleaning and sanitizing this area. Zone 2 surfaces are outside the direct contact surfaces with produce, but these can also potentially cause contamination. So you want to make sure that you're also cleaning and sanitizing these areas as well. Zone 3 in this example would be like the floor or potentially the walls. There's some windows there. So anything that's in the area that's around your food contact surfaces. And then zone 4, of course, might be outside. So of course, what you want to do is focus on your highest risk of contamination working down to your lowest risk. So you want to pay attention to, things within the building, within your packing facility, focusing on the direct food contact surfaces, followed by the ones adjacent to there, and then making sure your floors are being kept clean. And then for zone 4, you might do other things like, making sure that there isn't easy access, for instance, by rodents. That might be a way that you would address issues within the zone 4 areas, or making sure that things aren't being stored outside in your zone 4 areas that could potentially pose a risk inside your packing facility. Proper cleaning and sanitizing is really important. We always tell people you cannot sanitize a dirty surface. The reason for this is that sanitizers can bind up organic matter, which then makes them completely ineffective. So proper cleaning and sanitizing is a 4-step process. In the first process, you want to remove dirt and debris. The second step, you apply your detergent and scrub to lift off the rest of any debris that might be stuck on. Also, detergents can be effective at reducing microbial loads on surfaces. The third step is to, of course, rinse the detergent and any remaining debris off. And then the fourth step is to follow up with a suitable sanitizer that's approved for use on food contact surfaces. So these 4 steps are extremely important to follow properly. Produce safety regulations require that food packing materials have to be adequate for their intended use, and they need to either be cleanable or single use. They also need to be unlikely to support the growth and transfer of bacteria and prevent formation of Clostridium botulinum toxin. So basically, you don't want to be putting produce in a container that is sealed, that doesn't have any oxygen in it, that could potentially allow Clostridium, the organism Clostridium botulinum, to grow and produce toxins. So you want to make sure that any containers you're using are appropriate for the food and will keep the food safe. I've already talked a little bit about pest control, but you want to make sure that you do routine monitoring for pests and take measures to keep pests away from produce, food contact surfaces, and your packing materials. More information with packing containers, or more things you should be doing, is making sure that things are being kept clean and sanitized, of course. Packing containers need to be stored in a covered area off the floor, and you want to make sure that you're not having any dripping or condensation or other contact with water. Another thing that's important to know is that you shouldn't be stacking containers that might have produce and ice in them on top of one another. If something is contaminated, as the ice melts, it drips down and then it will contaminate everything below it. So you shouldn't be stacking containers with ice on top of one another. The produce safety regulations also require cold storage is not required, but if you are using cold storage, you want to make sure that the produce is protected from drips and condensate, and same with the food contact surfaces. And you also need to be using thermometers to be able to measure the temperature to ensure that whatever temperature you're storing, that you're cold storing the produce at, that it's being kept at that temperature. And you want to be checking the temperature on a regular basis. And then on top of it, you need to make sure that the thermometers are accurate. So you would need to have them checked at regular intervals to be in compliance with the regulations. And then with regard to transportation, you want to make sure whether you're hiring a company to transport your produce or you're transporting it yourself, the equipment needs to be adequately cleaned, and the transportation vehicle needs to be adequate for transporting produce. So you need to minimize the potential for contamination in whatever vehicle is transporting the produce. So you want to make sure the vehicles are clean. You want to inspect them prior to loading produce into the vehicles. We recommend using a clean liner to provide that extra barrier and to make sure that the produce is kept clean and safe. If you're hiring transportation, you want to make sure that you get cleaning and sanitizing documents from them. And then also, if you're using refrigeration and the vehicle is supposed to be transporting refrigerated produce, you want to make sure that the refrigeration units are working and that they're at the proper temperature. Records that are required under the produce safety rule are records for cleaning and sanitizing of tools, equipment, in containers and facilities. They can also include things like pest management, maintenance, and vehicle cleaning and inspection records. So some of the steps to take now to work towards some of this is to always, never harvest drop produce ever. We talked about part one, to making sure that workers are trained. And then we've also talked about them being trained to identify when produce cannot be handled, when there's a problem, and who to notify. So make sure that anybody that's working with you is trained. You want to have cleaning and sanitizing programs and have a regular schedule for those, and especially focus on those zone 1 and zone 2 as well is going to be important. So making sure that you're doing regular cleaning and sanitizing of those food contact surfaces. It's important to have a pest control program to make sure that your produce doesn't become contaminated after harvest. So that's something that you can implement now. And then also making sure that any transportation being used for transporting produce is adequate and that it's being kept clean. And then you can begin keeping records. Training records are going to be really important, and also your cleaning and sanitizing records. And then records for any monitoring that you're doing, pest control program records, and then any maintenance. So our last topic is developing a food safety plan. So the food safety plan describes potential risks and how to fix them. It should help you with prioritizing what risk you need to address first. It's a place where you can compile your policies and your standard operating procedures, and can really help you with just keeping all of your documentation together that may be required by other buyers, or if you're undergoing like a third-party audit system like Good Agricultural Practice audits. This can help you in making sure all your records are together and in one place. And then as you work towards being required to comply with the produce safety rule, this can really help you with ensuring that you have all your documents you need. So a farm food safety plan is not required under the produce safety rule, but we always encourage people to really have a farm food safety plan because it helps with improving food safety. So parts of the food safety plan should include the farm name and address, and then a description of the farm, the commodities you're growing, and a farm map can also be really helpful to lay out where there might be some risk and where different activities are occurring. You want to identify the name of the contact person for whoever's in charge of the food safety program on the farm. And then also include in your food safety plan any risk assessments you do, and then practices and policies to reduce risk that you're implementing. And then other documentation that can help, such as like your training records or test results. In the first step of putting together a farm food safety plan, you want to review your farm operations and really pay attention to those, identify what the risks are, review any adjacent land use, and especially if you're using surface water, any upstream hazards that might be in place. So basically just going through and identifying all your risks. And then after you've identified your risk, you want to prioritize which ones are most likely to cause a food safety issue so that you can begin to address those first. The second step then is to look at your assessment and start to develop practices where you can reduce these risks. On top of the practices, you might need to identify resources that are needed. So you might need to change out equipment at some point, have additional supplies, assign other people to manage risk. And we know that you don't have a endless bank account that you can draw from. So that's another reason why you really want to identify which is the most important risks that need to be dealt with now and which ones can be done when funds become available. And then if you're going to assign tasks that need to be done, you want to designate a person that's going to be in charge of each task so you can follow up and make sure that's done. In the third step, you want to write a plan for implementing your food safety plan, and then work on developing policies and putting those policies and procedures into writing. We've talked a lot about different records that you can start keeping now. So you want to develop a plan for record keeping and make sure that those records are in your food safety plan. And then you want to make sure that you review and update your plan annually or whenever there's changes, because you want to make sure that the plan is something that you can follow and stick with, and that it addresses what's being done on the farm and not what you wish to be occurring on the farm. So in summary of our webinar today, and I apologize, I'm running a couple minutes late, but you want to take steps now to ensure your produce is safe, because it's going to increase consumer confidence. It can help with meeting buyer requirements. Buyers are starting to get picky, and they want to make sure that you are adhering to food safety practices. So the more you can do to try to work towards compliance of the FSMA produce safety rule, then the more you're going to be in compliance with future buyer requirements, or even third-party requirements as well that are often required by buyers. We've talked a lot about water here, and we know it's a major vector for pathogens. So it's important to know your water quality and take steps to reduce risk. So those are things that you can start looking at now, is to really pay attention to that. So, and you want to have cleaning and sanitation programs in place to make sure things are being cleaned and sanitized properly, and that you're really paying attention to those food contact surfaces, and also tools, which includes tools and equipment. At the end of the day, we're trying to keep the produce safe and risk contamination. And then start taking steps to work towards having a farm food safety plan in place. So making sure that you have a comprehensive plan and that you're going to adhere to that and improve safety of your produce. So at the end of the day, if you're delivering safe produce, your buyers know your produce is safe, and you have these things in place, then that's going to increase your potential sales. So it's really important to do these things. Here are a list of additional resources, and these are these links are available in the handouts that Colette has sent to you. And with that, I can take any questions you might have.
We haven't had any questions come in, Stephanie, but we do have one comment. And so Kathy says that talking about contamination and the potential contamination from having ice in containers that are stacked on top of each other, she said that's how spinach is typically shipped. Ice on top, stacked in containers that are on top of one another.
Yes. Yes, so that's a problem. So the best practice is to not do that. If they are going to be stacked on one another, then it's a good idea to have some sort of barrier there so that it's not just dripping down from, the top package of spinach into the lower one. So any way you can try to prevent, potential contamination is going to be important. So we always tell people, do what you can to keep it covered so that you just don't get that seepage, because the best practice is to say that they shouldn't be stacked on one another, but we know that happens. And you even see it in the grocery stores where produce on ice is stacked on top of one another. So you want to try to take steps to prevent that from occurring, or at least prevent that drippage from running down into other containers.
Thank you for responding to that comment. We don't have any other questions that have come in, so I'm going to take just a quick moment to remind folks that you can find the recording of this webinar and the Produce Safety Part 1 webinar here on the Cultivating Success website. We just have one more webinar in our spring webinar series, and that is next Tuesday, June 2nd. The topic will be taking eggs to market, safe egg handling and delivery. We do have a quick webinar evaluation that will pop up in your browser when we close the webinar today. We do hope that you can take a moment to complete that and provide feedback on this webinar and identify other topics you would like to see covered when we resume our webinar series this fall. Thank you again very much for joining us, and have a really great week.